All right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Lieutenant Burchick. Very informative and heartfelt presentation. Excellent stuff. I'm sure everybody will get a lot out of that. We appreciate it. Our next presenter, Keith Stakes, is a fire protection engineer with the Underwriters Laboratories Fire Safety Research Institute. In addition to his research and studies on the effectiveness of fire service tactics, as well as advances in firefighter safety and fire ground operations, he currently serves as a volunteer battalion chief with the Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad in Montgomery County, Maryland. Additionally, Keith serves on the NFPA Technical Committee for Fire Service Training, the Editorial Advisory Board for Fire Rescue One, and Fire Chief Magazine. Keith, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chief. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name's Keith Stakes, research engineer with Underwriters Laboratories, and it's truly an honor to be here today in honor and memory of Lieutenant Flynn. So really, we're here for Nate, and Josh's presentation this morning was fantastic. I'm sure you all took a lot from that, and it's going to be a tough act to follow. But here, I'm going to be talking about fire ground coordination. So at the end of the day, if you take one message from this, one piece of information or learning away from this, I hope it was well worth your time. So I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about our mindset as firefighters and members of the fire service, what's important for when we're trying to digest and understand firefighting research and how it could be of aid to us. We're going to do a little bit of a review on the suppression study, which is the fire attack study focused on interior and exterior suppression methods. And then we're going to get into fire ground coordination, which was the most recent project we completed that was broken out into 3 parts, looking at single-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, specifically garden-style apartments, and then an exploratory look into commercial strip malls. So I'm not sure how much of the video you guys were actually able to see, but it's a great practical application of those 3 concepts: knowledge, understanding, and truth. So at the end of the day, just because we know something doesn't mean we necessarily know how to apply it or understand the why behind it. And then also, truth is truth. And that's a lot behind the science here, that the science is fact, and we're not here to argue the science, but we all come into this with a cognitive bias whenever we're trying to digest fire research and firefighting research. I have a bias as a researcher through my experience in the research, through my experience in the fire service, and through my culture and background growing up as well, just like much of you would in the fire service from your own given areas. So with that, we want to talk real quick about our experience on the fire ground. So every one of us watching this video, everyone in the room here could go to the same fire and take away a different experience. We always talk about firefighting being a complex puzzle, and what we mean by that is if you look at all of these puzzle pieces up here, these all play into the experience that you take away in a given incident. The fire dynamics of what the fire is doing at a given time, what type of building it is, what is your response model, whether it be here in Howard County, Maryland, down the road in Montgomery County, out in Los Angeles. Pre-incident bias, that's what you're coming into this experience with from previous times. Your arrival order and what type of function you're performing on the fire ground, and then the timing of all the different tactics that are occurring. So for example, let's say that you're coming to a fire, it's a 2-story single-family dwelling, you're showing up on the second due engine. So let's say your job is to get around to the Charlie side with a line, give a basement report. You find out that there's a walkout, so you force entry into the basement, and you find heavy floor-to-ceiling smoke that you're not able to see through. When you make that forcible entry and get access to the basement, let's say that you, as that second due engine, see a drastic improvement in conditions. You see that the smoke starts to lift, you get back visibility, the temperatures are dropping, you're not feeling as much heat, and you're able to work into the basement and see if you can find any fire or any potential victims. So your takeaway from that incident is that I went around the back, I forced a door, things got better, but what about the first due engine that's operating above you? Did they take away the same experience? Let's say they're on the first floor advancing a line to the rear of the building, and conditions all of a sudden get drastically worse about halfway back. Well, now the same action that you performed in a different location in the structure that was a positive effect on you was a negative effect on another crew inside that same building. So again, at the end of the day, our experience on the fire ground is different, even on the same crew, just position on the line. The nozzleman is going to have a different experience than the backup person, a different experience than the officer. So this is all about keeping an open mind, knowing that all of our experiences are different, and we're coming into everything with a bias. So with that, we'll get into reviewing the fire attack study a little bit. Again, the fire attack study was the first set of experiments where we were able to look at interior fire attack and get a good understanding of what's happening to potentially trapped occupants inside the building. So these are the fundamental building blocks that we used to design the coordinated experiments and figure out how we can best pair up suppression and ventilation actions. So the fire attack study was broken out into 3 pieces. We wanted to understand the mechanics of hose streams first. So we wanted to figure out how much our hose streams are entraining air and what does that do inside of a building. Secondly, we want to look at water mapping, which is how water gets distributed within inside of a compartment. And then we take those 2 pieces together and we start actually lighting things on fire and figuring out how all these pieces play together with one another. So the couple quick takeaways from the air entrainment portion of the study. If you are holding a solid or a straight stream, whether that be a smoothbore nozzle or a combination nozzle set to a straight stream, if you hold that in a fixed position, you're going to be moving anywhere between 1 to 2,000 CFM of air, cubic feet per minute of air. If you take that same solid or straight stream and start to manipulate that in any type of pattern, whether that be an O pattern, a T, a Z, an N, wall, ceiling, wall, whatever the pattern of choice is, if you're doing that at about the same speed, you're going to be moving somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 CFM. So a drastic step up from our 1 to 2 when we're holding our stream fixed. Then we go ahead and take that straight stream, rotate it to a fog, whether that be a 15 or 30 degree fog. Now we're starting to move a whole lot more air, upwards of 10 to 15,000 CFM. So when you start to hear these values, what can we compare that to? When we're moving as much as 10 or 15,000 CFM of air, we're now comparable to the same amount of air you'd be moving with a PPV fan. So we are capable of moving as much air with our hose stream that we would be the same putting a fan at the front door. So we need to be figuring out how this plays into our fire attack. On the bottom there is a video showing an improper exterior stream applied, where we're maximizing the amount of air that's entrained, minimizing the amount of water, and occluding the opening, which are all things we'll touch on here in a little bit. But you can see with the amount of air that's entrained, we're obviously increasing the fire behavior and redirecting the flow. When we talk about water mapping, again, this is where water's going inside the compartment based on how we deflect that stream. When we have a stream that's perpendicular to a surface, so picture taking a fire attack line and aiming it straight at a wall across from you, that water is going to radiate out in all 360 degrees. The shallower that angle of the stream, the more water is going to go directly ahead of you and not as much behind, which is why you always hear throughout the fire service that we want to start out with a steep angle. Whether that's on the outside of the structure, we're going to get the stream into the window, keep it as steep and tight as possible. That's going to provide the greatest surface coverage in the room. When that stream is rotating out in 360 degrees, the water's going to ride across the ceiling, it's going to hit all 4 walls, rain down the walls, and then come back across the floor. The same thing is going to happen when you're coming down a hallway and you turn into a bedroom that's on fire. You start with the stream high, get all the surfaces coated so you knock the gases out of play, and then you're going to drop the stream down onto the remaining fuels that are burning for base fire extinguishment. When we do that, and we know that the water's riding across the surfaces and down the walls, we're not getting as much water into the center of the compartment. On the inside, this is easily fixed by just dropping the stream down onto the contents, but on the exterior, it's going to require some sort of other application. So if I pull up to a house, I've got windows of fire showing on the 2nd floor, and the designation is that we're going to hit it from the outside first. We're going to apply that stream as steeply as we possibly can, get the water coated across all the surfaces in the compartment, take that from a vent-limited post-flashover fire back to a fuel-limited fire. In order to minimize my chances of regrowth, I need to do something else to get some water onto what's burning in the middle. So some applications here, you can see window header application. Simply before you shut the line down, bring the stream back and deflect it off the top of the window header, and now you get better coverage in the compartment. It buys you more time on your transition to the inside. The same thing applies on the interior. If we're working down a hallway towards a room or multiple rooms that are on fire, if you can find out which side of the hallway the room is on, you're going to hug that opposite wall with the line because you want to try and get a long distance relationship with the fire. You want to get water into that compartment as soon as you possibly can so that you're improving victim survivability and you're maintaining survivable space for anybody that's inside and any sort of hazards that you may encounter as well. So much like the window header, if you're on the inside of the building, you can apply that stream to the door frame of the compartment that's on fire, ride that up and down, and get water into the compartment much sooner. When we talk about training aids to help get across some of these points, we have two of them here that we're going to talk about. The first one is what we're calling the water mapping box. So this is basically a compartment that's the size of maybe an average to a small average bedroom, roughly 10 by 12. It is built with pressure-treated framing with half-inch lining. It could be used with either plywood or a composite type material, which we have here. We typically want to stray away from OSB as the stream would start to break that apart relatively quickly. What you notice that's unique about this compartment is that halfway up on all sides of the compartment is plexiglass. So this provides a great visual for everyone surrounding the compartment to be able to see where the water's actually going. We also have a water mapping hallway. So again, this was modeled off the hallway that was used in the experiments for the fire attack study. It's roughly about 25 feet long. It's about 3 to 3.5 feet wide. It's open on both ends, and then we have a perpendicular doorway that you see there at the far end on the left-hand side. Same sort of construction as the previous prop. They're built off the ground on casters, so you can move these around the training ground. You can attach them to one another, and then you've got a hallway going into a compartment. And we'll go through a couple videos here to show the takeaways. So we remember from the takeaways for the water mapping portion of this, that the more perpendicular the stream, the better coverage in the compartment. So you can see that as the nozzle operator brings that stream back to a very steep angle, the water's now going in all 360 degrees. That takes the water across the ceiling, coats all the walls in the compartment, and down across the floor. As you see that angle get shallower in the compartment, all the water's going directly across and away from you, so you're not coating all the surfaces and cooling them. And we know that here in the United States, we flow high volumes of water because we want to cool as many surfaces as possible, contract the gases, take that fire back to fuel limited, and really knock it out. The side view here, you can see a perfect representation of coating the surfaces. As that stream comes in at a steep angle, you lose complete visibility of what's going on in the compartment because you've completely coated the surfaces. All the walls and the ceiling are getting wet instantaneously, knocking those gases out of play, contracting them, and really cooling the environment. The shallower that angle, you start to get visibility back because you're not doing as great of a job with surface cooling as you would with a steeper angle. So again, it's pretty down and dirty, quick, but very dramatic visuals to help get these points across. Then we take a look at the hallway. In this particular case, we're looking at a wall-ceiling wall application. So that's riding the wall up across the ceiling, back down the other wall, and then going back the other way. It's not too much different than an O pattern, with the exception that you're not coating that floor at the bottom. So you'd be wanting to hit that with an occasional floor sweep if you chose this application. What the prop shows, and this composite material does a great job of showing it, is that the water is not hitting off the hallway walls and bouncing across to the other side of the hall. The water hits that wall and is going to ride down that wall like a sheet and coat the surface instantaneously as it goes. What we notice, though, is when we do that same application and we pan around to that doorway, which would be the doorway into a bedroom, we can see that our water application in the hall is not getting any water in that bedroom whatsoever. So if that bedroom is what's on fire, the application of the water in the hallway is only to allow us to advance to actually get to put water in that compartment. And if we're not trying to get water in that compartment sooner, we're going to have to get up to the threshold of that doorway to actually be able to start to have an impact on this fire. So as we mentioned earlier, one of the ways to handle that is if you hear an audible change in your stream application, it's going to sound pretty uniform as you're riding the walls moving down the hall. But if you then suddenly hit a perpendicular surface, being that door frame, focus on that for a little bit and see if you can ride that up and down. When you do that, you can see how much water there, when we pan around the side, you can get into the room much earlier in that advance. So what are some takeaways of victim survivability from that previous study? Biggest and most important, fire conditions on size up do not translate to interior survivability. What I see on the exterior of the building is not at all representative of what might be indicative on the inside of whether or not somebody could survive. So where are we going with this? It should not be our job to be on the exterior of the building saying this room's survivable, that room's not survivable, this room's survivable. It should be up to us in the fire service to say, am I able to get in there and search that space? is this searchable space, not is this survivable space? Because the data we take shows that the burn injuries don't directly correlate to fatality. You know, it's really dose and time dependent as to whether or not these spaces are survivable. So obviously the survivability profile is going to decrease with the time of exposure increase. So the longer you're in there, the less likely you are to survive. Most victims are affected by toxic overthermal exposure, meaning the gases that any victim would be inhaling is much more lethal than any potential thermal exposure, based on the fact that the majority of the structure is going to be filling up with smoke, and our thermal threat is going to be isolated to really where that fire is. Proximity and elevation are key. So the closer to the actual fire inside the structure we are, the worse off we are. And the higher in the space, the worse off we are. Obviously, the space is going to fill from the top down. Therefore, the higher you are, the worse off you are. What are some takeaways for exterior water application? Steep angle provides maximum surface cooling. We just showed that with the videos in the props. Follow-up application limits regrowth. So if I choose exterior water, I need to make sure I'm coating all the surfaces in that compartment to buy myself the most time. If I'm a floor below that fire or several floors below that fire and I get water into the compartment with a steep angled stream, I know that I'm not getting the center wet. So I've got to do something else to follow up to buy myself more time. So I bring that stream back to the header, get better distribution in the compartment, and really take care of that fire. If I'm on grade or at plane with where that fire is, once I do my initial steep angle, we still want to do that first because that's taking the gases out of play, and you're going to see the most drastic improvement in conditions. If I'm at grade, I can get up to the window, put the nozzle in the window, and whip it around, much like the old nozzleman videos, whether it be a half bale with a smooth bore, turn it to a little bit of a fog on a combination, or just in an O pattern. You're going to get what you weren't able to get with your initial stream. So the big three, like we showed with that initial air entrainment video, if you're applying exterior water, you want to get the most amount of water in the compartment with the least amount of air, and whatever you do, don't block the opening. So when we block the opening and it's not able to serve as an exhaust, we're then going to redirect that flow somewhere else. We've introduced high pressure in that compartment, and now it needs to find a new low pressure exhaust, so somebody is going to feel the effects on the other end of the line. The big takeaways for an interior advance: flowing and moving, meaning opening the nozzle and keeping it open in the entire time, is going to be the biggest, going to have the biggest positive impact to improve victim survivability behind the line. So think about moving down a hallway towards a compartment or multiple compartments on fire. If I open that line and I keep it open for the duration of the advance, I'm stopping the products of combustion from coming back over the nozzle crew, so it's keeping them in a safe space. It's also improving survivability behind the line, because not only are we stopping products of combustion from coming back over us, the line being open, we're utilizing that air entrainment from the stream to help bring in fresh air with us. So we're improving conditions everywhere that we've passed as we go, and we're really taking control of that space. An O pattern or a wall ceiling wall on your advance is going to maximize the surface cooling. The O pattern seems to be the easiest, most natural thing to do. A wall ceiling wall, you know, you're breaking the pattern and coming back the opposite direction. But with an O pattern, it seems fairly straightforward, fairly easy to replicate mindlessly, as long as you've done that on the training ground. And that provides a great means to block those products from coming back over you, while at the same time taking advantage of the air entrainment. Once we get to the compartment, we touched on the fact that we want to start out with a high initial application of water. We're going to coat all the surfaces simultaneously, take the gases out of play, bring that back from a fully developed vent-limited fire to a fuel-limited fire, and then we're going to drop the stream down onto the base fuels and finish the job. So proper water mapping wins, whether you're on the outside or the inside of the building. If you know that water is a line of sight tool, and if you're not seeing an improvement in conditions, change the angle in which you're applying water, change the surface in which you're deflecting the water off of, keeping in mind the things that we talked about with maximizing water, minimizing air. The point here about contraction outweighing expansion with solid and straight streams is simply referring to the concerns that arise around steam. So whenever we are applying a solid or a straight stream and we're maximizing our surface cooling, we're not going to have steam concerns, because the gases are contracting and the temperatures are dropping at such a high rate that that contraction is going to outweigh any concern from steam expansion that you might have. Another quick point on steam is that with the amount of water that we flow in the States, 150, 160 gallons per minute being fairly common, and we're rapidly cooling, the droplets are fairly large that are coming out of our nozzles. So a lot of the times these droplets are going into the layer, they're absorbing heat, they're cooling the surface, and then a lot of them are going to come right back down the other side. So a lot of these droplets from our host streams aren't even necessarily converting to steam, they might just heat up in the layer and come back down the other side. The last point here, total amount of water needed for 2 rooms post-flashover was fairly minimal. Again, this was from the fire attack experiments, so it's focused on room and contents fires. We weren't looking at what happens if that fire gets into the structure or if you need to open anything up for that matter, but several rooms that have gone post-flashover, room and contents, it was less than 250 gallons to take care of those fires. One of the tech panel members on the fire attack study did a great job of kind of summarizing this for us, and they went with these terms. Knockback would be basically your first stage of extinguishment. So if you are off plane, meaning you're not at the same level in which the fire is, whether you're on the inside or the outside of the building, on the outside of the building, this would be a case where you're a floor below applying water to a room that's above you. Or let's say if you're on the inside, it could be twofold. You could be at the top of basement stairs applying water down, or you could be in a great room applying water up to the second floor to try and get your long distance relationship early. If you're off plane with the fire, the best you can do is start to get the fire knocked back. Once you get on plane with that fire, again, inside or outside, you're now able to get a better knockdown condition. So again, we talk about the exterior, get the stream up in the window, whip that around, better coat the surfaces. Now we're able to get more of a knockdown situation, or obviously on the inside, we're going to get down to the compartment and apply water in. In order to get base fire extinguishment, the nozzle's got to be where the fire is and where the fire originated from. So we've got to get inside the structure and inside those compartments that we're burning to really get things opened up and moved around, take care of any smoldering combustion that might become flaming later, and really put the fire to bed. With that, we've gotten our mind in the right place to be able to digest this information, and we've started to do a recap on everything that's been put forth up to this point. So the coordinated fire attack study, which we're going to be talking about now, again, is broken out into our 3 pieces: single-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, and then a brief look into commercial strip malls. The goal of this study was to perform experiments in acquired structures to see what tactics that we've learned in the lab are going to hold true out in the street. We obviously try to design the structures and the experiments in the lab to be as realistic as possible, but there are limitations. So now we want to go to the street, we want to get buildings that you would respond to on a daily basis, and we want to perform those experiments in those to see what's going to hold true. Up to this point, the research that's been done has also been focused on tactics independent from another. So what we mean by that is all the previous projects looked at things by themselves. So we looked at horizontal ventilation, studied that through and through, best ways to do it, when you should do it, so on and so forth. Vertical ventilation, positive pressure ventilation and attack, different types of structural issues, and then again up to the suppression study, which we just reviewed. Now we want to say, all right, we know all the findings from these independent tactics. How do we put it together and make the best coordinated fire ground we can? What's the best type of ventilation to apply when with a given type of suppression method? So we start out and we try and get everybody in a room. We'll talk about the tech panel here briefly, but we get a lot of fire service assistance in designing these projects and experiments. And we say, all right, what does coordination mean? And we had about an 8-hour discussion and still didn't come up with an answer at the end of the day. But the best we could come up with was a systematic approach to the implementation of tactics. And this is going to come into play whether we're talking about sequential or simultaneous operations. So whether that's ventilation preceding or coming after suppression, or whether that's ventilation at the same time as suppression, at the end of the day, it's all about timing and making sure that people know what's going on and it's properly communicated. So some of the outstanding questions starting out this project. One of the most important ones, is there a safe time window between venting and beginning suppression? So let's say that based on our response model, the truck company got there first and they're starting their actions, whether that be communicated and coordinated or not. If they start venting ahead of suppression, is there a safe time window? We know it's going to depend on what type of structure we're in, how big the structure is, where the fire's located, where the fire's going, how big the fire is, and then the specific type of vent tactic. Some are more forgiving than others, whether it be horizontal, vertical, or positive pressure. Can any venting begin after exterior water application and prior to interior extinguishment? So that question is getting around the fact that if a company gets there and chooses to apply exterior water, can we begin any ventilation measures then while they're transitioning to the interior? And then there's the lingering question of what if the fire room ceiling fails or the hose stream punches through during an exterior water application? So let's say you choose to apply exterior water. We've all seen the YouTube videos. The stream goes in the window. They may get an initial darkening down of the room, but then the fire just comes churning back and the stream's basically going through fire and nothing's happening. A lot of times that could be because the drywall or the ceiling surface has weakened and the stream that we're putting through there at 165 gallons per minute just punches right through the drywall, or it's weakened enough to the point where the drywall's actually dropped down. You might get lucky enough where it's a floor below where the attic space would be and it rides across a joist space and comes down into the compartment. But again, we know water mapping, it would be fairly limited to that channel. Or if you're on a top floor and that stream punches through, it might be going into the attic space or across the building into another room. So what happens? What are the visual cues surrounding that, and how can we have a positive impact? And then lastly, what type of ventilation method in conjunction with proper suppression is going to provide the greatest positive impact to victims? Like much of our projects, this work was funded through the Assistance to Firefighters Grants Program. So again, that's federal funding, and without this, we would not be able to do this vital work to be able to provide the why behind what we do on the fire ground. And with that funding comes the ability for us to put together a project technical panel. So for each of the projects that we're going to study inside UL, we put together a technical panel of fire service experts from across the country with a little bit of international influence sprinkled in. And really, we want to get people from their first day on the job to senior chiefs that are retiring, from the largest metropolitan departments to the smallest rural departments, career and volunteer, you name it. We're trying to get people that are interested in a specific discipline, that have experience in that discipline, whether it be in their fire service experience or their outside line of work, and provide some guidance to us to help create a project that's going to be meaningful to you guys in the fire service at the end of the day. So the list of folks here you see is the technical panel for the coordinated attack study, a wide breadth of experience from across the United States, and their involvement in the project starts out at the very beginning. We get together for an initial meeting. We say, all right, this is the funding we were awarded, and these are some questions that we have, and here's some avenues that we were thinking about going about this. The tech panel might come in and completely derail it in a positive manner and say, no, we should go this way. This is much more impactful for the fire service, and then we'll pivot right there with them and find out a way to make it happen. They're going to come out to the experiments. They're going to help on the fly say, well, maybe we should be doing this type of suppression. This would be more applicable to the answers that we need. And then at the end of the experiments, they're going to be right there with us, diving into the data, trying to understand things and come up with conclusions that are going to be applicable. So we start out part one, single-family dwellings. Again, all the research to date, almost all of the research to date has been on the residential fire environment. So now we're seeing how that translates from the lab to the field. And we look at 8 structures in 2 different cities. We had the opportunity to travel to Sydney, Ohio, and Beaver Creek, Ohio. We looked at 8 different single-family homes, 3 of which were single-story, 5 of which were 2-story. We did 20 experiments across those 8 homes, 14 of which were second-floor bedroom fires, and 6 of which were first-floor kitchen fires. Again, those numbers and those scenarios, which we'll talk about shortly, came about with input from the project tech panel. So what are the variables we want to look at? Again, this is coordinated fire attack, so it's not just suppression, it's also ventilation. We want to look at the location of initial water application. Are we starting from the outside or the inside, and in what manner? Are we going to pair that with a given type of ventilation, whether it be no ventilation whatsoever, horizontal, vertical, positive pressure, keeping in mind that positive pressure could be attack or ventilation. The difference there being attack is during suppression, ventilation would be after. And then obviously hydraulic ventilation, which would be performed by the same crew putting out the fire. And then at the end of the day, coordination is about timing. So are we doing these tactics prior to suppression, during suppression, or after suppression, and what's the impact? We're going to cover the methods here, which kind of give you a basis of what we were looking at studying. So for bedroom fires, we're starting out bedroom fires. We remember those are on the second floor of the home. Method 1 was looking at interior fire attack with ventilation after fire control. So suppression begins, the crew gets there, they get to the compartment, knock it down and say, all right, fire's knocked. Now we begin a series of ventilation measures. These are all different experiments, but one would be no ventilation, so that gives us our base case. If we get in, we knock down the fire and don't do anything else, what happens in the building? Versus what happens if we turn that nozzle to a fog pattern or rotate a smooth bore and start to hydraulically vent out of the fire room windows, or if we're horizontally venting that floor or the floor above. Vertical ventilation, either over the fire or remote from the fire, and then lastly, positive pressure. And this is the sequence of events that you're going to see is fairly common throughout. So the first fire department intervention, we're going to get there, we're going to pop the front door. The crew's going to get ready, do their final click-in of their mask, and then we're going to start to advance. That little pause there, once the front door has been opened, gives us a good indication of are conditions changing right away based on that front door being opened, and can you see that from that vantage point? Method 2, now we're looking at interior suppression with ventilation prior to fire control. So if ventilation is preceding suppression, what does that look like? Same type of ventilation methods we're looking at. Again, 2 types of vertical, either over the fire room or remote from the fire room. And then the suppression crew is going to go in and take care of the fire. Method 3 would be exterior fire control. So now water's starting to be applied into the building from the outside, and we want to ventilate after the fire has been initially knocked. Either no ventilation, positive pressure ventilation, or taking all second floor windows at once, which we would consider horizontal ventilation, but trying to maximize that. Method 4, exterior fire control effectiveness. So this is really getting into that question of what happens if I apply an exterior stream and I'm not seeing a change in my visual cues at the window. The window is still venting fire. I'm not seeing any change based on the water I'm applying. Something's going on. I've got to do something else. So we went through a series of actions here that started with failing the bedroom ceiling. We didn't want to have a hole cut in the bedroom ceiling when the experiment started because we know that would affect the fire growth, and therefore we would have a different fire and wouldn't be able to compare it to something else. So we had it rigged up such that we would be able to drop out the bedroom ceiling after the room went to flashover. So the room goes to flashover, we give our countdown, we say, all right, drop the ceiling drops. We know that that might influence fire behavior a little bit, so we wait for that fire to steady out, and then we're going to apply our first means of water via the steep angle. So we apply the steep angle, we do it for a certain period of time. Are we seeing a change in cues or not? We're going to shut the line down, wait for the fire to recover, then apply the lentil hit, which again is the window header. We talked about getting us better distribution, and then see what that does. Then we're going to transition to the inside and go for base fire extinguishment. Talking about kitchen fires now, these are fires on the first floor of the building. Interior suppression with ventilation before fire control versus exterior fire control with ventilation post initial water flow. So what this is talking about here is, are we able to start doing those ventilation measures after exterior water while the crew is transitioning to the inside? Have we done enough with the fire that we can start to get the space cleared while the crew's still advancing on the inside? So we will jump into the tactical considerations. And tactical considerations, if you haven't heard of them at this point, is really our home takeaways or conclusions or summaries from the project that is for the fire service to figure out how to digest. So again, this is the information that comes out of the study that we think would be valuable. It's up to you guys to figure out how it fits in your response model on a given fire with a different type of structure, different weather conditions, so on and so forth. So because we're trying to build off of previous research and see what still holds in the real world, we want to look at those previous tactical considerations, some of which we highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, and see whether or not those still hold and what we see from this study pertaining to those points. Then we have 3 new ones that came about from this study. Timeline of coordination, so really hitting on the timing of our actions and what that impact is. Alternative hits during suppression. You've heard me mention it a couple times with the window hit or the door hit going on the inside before you get to a compartment. Again, that's something that from the fire attack study we knew was going to be valuable, but we weren't doing it in that study yet because that's when we found it out. So here was our first chance to employ that during fires and see what happens. And then lastly, local ventilation for remote occupants. We know that ventilation is not just applicable to near where the fire is, but it's going to be applicable across the structure. And what does that mean for anybody that might be trapped in a remote location? So starting out with water usage in residential fires. The chart you see there now is the water usage data from these coordinated fire attack experiments. The notation there on the bottom, max from suppression study was 257 gallons. That's talking about the fire attack study that we discussed in the beginning. And when we had 2 rooms of fire with fire coming down the hallway, knowing that it was just room and contents, but to knock out 2 rooms of fire with applying water on the approach, the most amount of water we used was 257 gallons. So that was out of an 1 3/4 inch line, 200 feet long, flowing 150 or 160 GPM to take care of 2 fully developed post-flashover rooms and use water on the approach, only 257 gallons. So keep in mind as we start talking about water usage throughout the presentation about how much you're showing up with on your given engine, whether it be 300, 500, 750, 1250. Keep in mind that as we move forward as far as how this would apply to your response model. So when we look at the chart for these experiments themselves, there's 2 shades of colors. The darker of which being the amount of water that was needed for fire control. So again, fire control being defined as the point at which the suppression crew said, all right, we've got the fire knocked down. They've applied water on the approach. They've got water into the compartment. Their shoulders are past the threshold of the compartment. They're starting to get visibility back and they feel things are under control. So they call out on the radio, fire's knocked. Then we mark how much water was used up to that point. Then any further overhaul or opening up of the structure, knowing that now we're out in the field in real buildings, we're not in lab buildings that we try and protect. Any additional water there is used during that overhaul period or the mop-up period. But one trend you see across the board there, even including overhaul and mop-up, we didn't have a single one of the 20 experiments where we exceeded 500 gallons of water. So again, go back to what we just mentioned previously with how much you might be showing up with a single piece of apparatus. Water mapping wins. If water goes where it needs to go, you do not need much for suppression. Obviously, there are unknowns about voids and pipe chases and where you might have fire going up into the attic in an extended operation, or where you're in a position as the suppression crew where you can't properly map. We'll talk about that in the garden apartment experiments. But if you get into a situation where you can't properly map and you just need to flow to be able to be where you are, you're obviously going to need more water. Different trends that you can pick out across the board, but again, the big takeaway being less than 500 gallons throughout. And that's with acquired structures and overhaul and mop-up. Speed of transition and regrowth. So one of the things from the fire attack study that we've hit on briefly was that if we don't do that follow-up application of water, when we're applying water from the outside, we're going to experience regrowth concerns relatively quickly by the time we get to the inside to finish up extinguishment, unless we do some sort of alternative means of distribution. So when we take a look at the top 3 charts there, these are temperature charts from fire rooms. The top 3 charts there are from 3 different experiments. They're all kitchen fires. You see on the left-hand side there, that starts our time 0. The time 0 in this case is right when the fire department intervention started. The blue shaded regions, you're looking at water flow. So we see that in all 3 of those cases, as soon as water starts flowing, the temperatures are going to drop. You see a little bit of a gap there where there's no blue shaded region, followed by a follow-up blue shaded region. That second blue shaded region is when we got up to the window, opened up the nozzle again, and wet what was in the middle of the compartment. You see the temperatures there. All the temperatures are going to continue to decline. We've now further wet the fuels in that compartment. We're not concerned about regrowth as much as we would have been before because we're confident in wetting those surfaces. The only outlier there would be in experiment 20 in the top right. Towards the right-hand side of the chart, you see the ceiling temperatures start to rise again. That's an indication where we didn't get water to one given surface in a specific spot, and we started to see a little bit of rise. So obviously, increasing the speed of our transition is going to decrease any regrowth concerns. And then adding in our additional distribution of water is going to take care of that for us. Whereas if we look at the bottom 3 charts, now we're looking at second floor bedroom fires. With the second floor bedroom fires, I can't walk up to the window and put the nozzle in the window. So in this case, we didn't do any follow-up distribution afterwards, and we wanted to see what would happen. In all 3 cases there, you see that we saw an initial decrease in temperatures because of the water being applied. We did it at a steep angle, which we know had the most positive impact on surface cooling. But as soon as we shut that line down, we started to see temperatures rebound. We know that all the furniture inside of a compartment is not all against the walls. The bed is going to stick out 6 feet into the room. The dresser's going to be off the wall. So these things that didn't get wet during our initial application are still going to be burning. We might have taken the gases out of play, but we're still going to have fire in that compartment. So we see temperatures start to rebound, and obviously we need to get inside, be fairly hasty about that, and start to apply water from the inside and take care of base fire extinguishment. Effectiveness of remote application. So this is going back to build off of our long-distance relationship with the fire. Water is a line-of-sight tool, though. If I apply a stream into this room, I can't get the stream to go across the room, out the door, and down the hall. It's only going to go where I can physically see and where the water can be ahead of me. Because of that, the room configurations in these acquired structures are going to dictate how early we could get water into the compartment. For example, the 2 pictures on the bottom there, that's an example from one of the structures. I believe this was in Beaver Creek. The 3D schematic there you see is from the structure with the roof cut off. The fire was in the top floor bedroom on the alpha side of the building, so that's the closest towards the bottom of the slide. The 2 front windows on that structure were exhausting fire whenever we started intervention. Again, we wanted to look at fires that had gone post-flashover and were fully developed. And then the crew advanced in, up the stairs, and was going to take care of interior fire attack. So the picture on the right-hand side of the screen there is from the nozzle firefighter or the officer's GoPro on the helmet. And you can see that as we advance up the stairs, you look to the left, you can see through the banister burning, and then obviously the room on the other side that's gone post-flashover. So much like most of you would, we're going to start applying water from there at the stairs before we get up to make that turn on the same floor. This is an indication where I'm using the distance and the ability to be below that fire to my advantage. So I still have visibility, I can see what's going on. Any darkening that's going to happen from suppression is going to happen above me. So I can apply water and improve conditions in that compartment and on that floor before we even get there. Placement of a vertical vent hole. So this goes back a couple studies to the vertical ventilation study. And really, at the end of the day, what these single-family experiments showed us was that as long as the vertical ventilation opening was made in close coordination with the suppression operation, you were able to see a positive impact. That was a fairly narrow time window, such that if that ventilation preceded suppression by any length of time, you would start to see a deterioration in conditions. One of the interesting things here that we saw was that the improvement was most noted on the inlet portion of the flow path. So picture yourself as different crews. The engine crew that's going to be advancing in, they're going to open the door and they're going to work to the fire at the same time that the truck crew is going to be on the roof making that hole. So the inlet portion of the flow path is going to be from the front door through the compartments or the hallways to where that fire compartment is, and then obviously the exhaust being up and out the hole. So we saw the most improvement in the inlet portion, which is where this is going to come to validate the experience that a lot of people have on the engine company, saying as soon as that truck company opened that roof, I got lift and I was able to advance. That's validated here by the fact that we saw that improvement in the inlet portion. But any increase in time between that topside vent and proper water mapping on the inside, you would start to see a deterioration. So while there was a benefit to the vertical ventilation opening being made, it was very limited in manner, so obviously close coordination is necessary. Survivable spaces on arrival. Again, we talked about that with the fire attack study. A lot of this was validated here. Closer you are to the fire, the worse off you are. Elevation being key, the higher in the space, the worse off you are. One thing that was interesting was if you were in the inlet portion of the flow path, being the distance between the front door and where the fire is, once that front door got opened and fresh air started to work its way back to feed the fire, it actually improved conditions low in the space, which was an improvement for victim survivability, even though conditions above were deteriorating as the fire started to grow. At the end of the day, we come to the same conclusion. There's no clear-cut answer. It's extremely difficult to look at a building and say this is survivable and this is not, so we need to focus on where we can search and how we can clear it as the fire service as we make our advance. Timeline of coordination. Now we're out of validating previous tactical considerations and coming up with new ones. Basically, at the end of the day, ventilation closely timed with suppression is your win. So even closely timed suppression and ventilation, we would start to see some deterioration of conditions in the fire room. meaning that if I was horizontally venting the fire room at the same time that suppression began, I could see fire growth, but it was limited to the fire room. So as long as you started to apply water in a fairly quick manner after you made that ventilation opening, that deterioration in conditions was limited to the fire room, which was already post-flashover at that point. We briefly touched on the fact that as that front door gets opened and you have fresh air draw in, you might get an improvement in conditions low as the temperatures drop and visibility increases, at the same time that that fire is growing and then deteriorating conditions above you. So obviously starting suppression early is key. Once you get the nozzle open, keep it open. We know the benefits of flowing and moving. And then ventilation is not just local to the fire and the operating crews. We've got to consider remote locations, which we'll touch on here in a moment. Alternative hits during suppression. This is the 2 experiments where we failed the sealing to try and figure out what would happen and what you saw from the outside. So taking a look at experiment 13 on the left-hand side, you can see the depiction of the stream and the structure there. We cut the vertical, or the opening in the ceiling there to be perpendicular with the window in this case. So we dropped the drywall and the plaster and lath out of the way, but we actually left the rafters in play in this experiment. So we wanted to see if the ceiling had failed, but the rafters were there, were you able to get any sort of distribution that was a positive impact? Versus experiment 14, we put the hole in the ceiling lengthways and actually cut the rafters completely out. So now we were 100% confident the stream was going into the attic and away from this room to see what our benefits were. And at the end of the day, while you may have a change in visual cues, meaning the stream going in the compartment and you start to see darkening down, if you looked paired with what you would see with your eyes with a thermal imaging camera, the thermal imaging camera would show you that that heat was still there and you were not able to effectively knock that fire with the initial stream. As soon as that line gets shut down, the fire's coming right back and out that window. So then in both cases, we bring that stream back to the window header and the lintel and ride that, and that stream drops off into the compartment and gave us great suppression. Local ventilation for remote occupants. So again, this is talking about venting far from the fire, but in an area where an occupant might be. So for example, if you've got a kitchen fire on the first floor and all your bedrooms are up on the second floor, we can't forget about quick and rapid ventilation of the second floor as soon as water's on that fire. So experiment 10 is a case where no ventilation occurred after suppression. Experiment 12 is a case where we vented everywhere in a remote location as soon as water was on the fire. Obviously, 1 minute, 2 minutes, and 4 minutes afterwards, you've got great improvement in visibility, and you're starting to get conditions back to ambient in those areas. With that, we're going to transition to multifamily. So this is still the residential fire environment, but we've now got a higher life hazard. So, you have a question, Chief? Sure. Yep. Yep. So in the fire attack study, we used 150 GPM and 75 psi out of a combination nozzle. For a smoothbore nozzle, it was 165 at 50. And then for the coordinated experiments that we did here, it was either 150 at 50 on a combination or 165 at 50 on a smoothbore. Yep. Yep. So all of that varied based on the experiment that we did, and the best answer I can give you there is that all of these compartments, based on the structure, the given experiment we were performing, and whether it was this study or the previous, was we had a high enough heat release rate being comparable to your BTUs in kilowatts. The fuel load was high enough that the fire was going to be able to sustain post-flashover for the duration of the experiment. So that's the simplest answer to give here, is saying that we had enough fuel to keep these fires burning post-flashover for as long as we needed to study a given tactic. So for the single-family portion of this, again, looking at the single-family residential dwellings, we did not do anything with simultaneous streams at this point. It's definitely of interest to us. When we start talking about the multifamily experiments here, I'm going to get to a case where we actually had simultaneous streams coming from opposing directions, and it was actually needed in order for the crew to be able to advance, and we were able to get some good information out of that. But there's been a lot of discussion around, All right, so based on your response model, let's say the incident commander determines the first due engine's going to go to whatever window they want to put water in and send the second due engine to the inside. Do you have them stop flowing? Do they keep flowing? Everything we see on the research side says that if you're effectively mapping and you're effectively coating surfaces, you're not seeing negative impacts from water. So where you see negative impacts from water means you've got too much air and not enough water, and you've probably blocked an opening. So most things that we're seeing, and again, we're obviously going to be studying further, is that if you're properly applying water, it doesn't matter whether it's the outside or the inside or whether it's happening at the same time. Sure. Say that one more time because I have to write. Okay.
What has a larger impact on the amount of CFMs? Gallon per minute or nozzle pressure?
All right, so the question was, what has a larger impact on the CFMs, gallon per minute or the nozzle pressure? So what we saw from the air entrainment was it actually was not necessarily about the gallons per minute or the nozzle pressure. It was about how it was being applied, meaning what type of stream it was, and how fast you were applying it. So when we did the air entrainment experiments, we went through a variety of nozzles, a variety of flows, variety of pressures, and if you were flowing the same type of stream at roughly the same speed, that's what was driving the air entrainment, not at all how much water you were flowing or what the nozzle pressure was. Perfect? All right. So getting into multifamily, again, we're looking at a different structure type now. So we're looking at garden-style apartments. And garden-style apartments to us, again, it's a loose definition that could change based on your geography or where you are, but you see the structures here. These were in Cobb County, Georgia, in the city of Marietta, which was just to the northwest of Atlanta. They had an entire complex that was coming down to be able to build a highway. So we were able to luck out with getting a variety of buildings with all the same configuration, same size of apartment, same layout, so on and so forth. So type 5 dwelling, again, wood framing here. We had a lot of the key indicators of a multifamily dwelling that were of interest to us. We had common void spaces, common pipe chases. We had combustible balconies on the exterior, combustible siding and combustible exteriors themselves to really look into exposure concerns when you've got fire venting out of a window. And again, it's a 3-story building. It's going to be 2 from the Alpha side and 3 from the Charlie side. We focused on all single-bedroom units here. So we focused on the smaller of the units based on the fact that we had more of them to be able to compare. They had a kitchen, a dining room, living room, and a bedroom, and they were roughly 800 square feet. So fairly small in size, but again, it's the residential environment, just now in a different structure type. The ventilation openings that were possible in any given apartment would obviously be the apartment door itself. It could be the slider on the living room, which was, again, the full glass height door that would slide open. There was a window in the kitchen and then a larger double window in the bedroom. This is a 2D top-down floor plan of the garden-style apartments. If we start out at the lower level, we remember we had 2 in the front, 3 in the rear. So the 3 in the rear gets us to our 2 lower-level apartments, which are on the Charlie side of the building. You see the staircase in the center there come down. You make a 180 and go back to 2 apartments. On the first floor and second floor, we had 4 apartments each. So we had 2 on the Alpha side, 2 on the Charlie side. What you notice here in the schematic, and what you might have picked up in the previous picture, which will come again, is that these buildings started out with an open breezeway. So what I mean by that is when we got there, the center stairwell was open to the exterior on both the front and the back. We wanted to look at a higher hazard scenario with an enclosed stairwell, so we built walls to block that off and put a single doorway on the Alpha side at the center. So what that did for us was give us the ability to study what would happen in the stair if a door got left open, if you employed one tactic versus another. How do you best protect the egress path? Knowing that if it was an open breezeway, you would still have some concerns, but it's got the ability to exhaust the smoke much easier, obviously, than the enclosed. From these plans here, if you just pick any one apartment and follow through with me, you see that the door from the stairwell opens into the living room. There's a small coat closet either to the right or the left. The living room goes out to your sliding glass door and your combustible balcony. You then go further into the common space where you have a dining nook to the side with a fully furnished kitchen on the other. And then you go farthest back into the apartment, past a bathroom into the bedroom. And then just before the bedroom, you see a square in the center of each of these units. That's your common pipe chase that ran throughout. It was fairly well fire stopped in most of these units. We didn't further fire stop it, and we didn't take away any fire stopping. We left it as is to see what would happen. This is a side cut here looking at the center stairwell itself. Again, we talked about the fact that we added walls to the front and the rear to make it enclosed. So the Alpha side on the left, Charlie side on the right. Again, 2 in the front, 3 in the rear. You come inside the building, you can either immediately go up the stairs to your 4 apartments above. You can go further back into that first floor and access your first floor apartments, or continue further back down the stairs, make a 180, and then 90 out into 2 apartments. The icons there that you see on the diagram are some of the instrumentation that we used in these experiments. The green triangles there are our temperature sensors, giving us an indication of what the temperature is at any given height in the stair. The blue circles there are our gas concentration. That's a 2-fold measurement for us. It tells us what's going on with the fire growth in terms of whether it's ventilation limited or not. We're looking at oxygen, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. And that also, again, gives us insight into victim survivability and whether or not they'd be able to survive or breathe in a given space. The orange crosses there are our pressure measurements. That's, again, looking at the fire growth within inside the structure. And then outlined at the bottom here are the different scenarios that we were studying in these experiments. So scenario 1 was all lower level or first floor bedroom fires, and the big takeaway there was we were looking at fires with no fire showing on arrival. So you get there and you've got varying levels of smoke showing or nothing showing. We're going to employ a bunch of different tactics based on the fire location. Let's see what happens. Experiment 2A and 2B as a part of scenario 2 was taking a look at first floor bedroom fires, and we wanted to do our comparison of positive pressure. Positive pressure during the attack, so positive pressure attack, or positive pressure after fire knockdown, which would be PPV or positive pressure ventilation. Scenarios 3 and 4 were our suppression comparisons, inside first versus outside first. We also changed the fire location there. So if we had a first floor kitchen fire versus a second floor kitchen fire, how does our access or our placement of our stream play into those comparisons? And then scenario 5 and 6 were kind of unique. These experiments were set up to replicate some line of duty incidents that have been studied previously, local to the area here as well as across the states, where you'd have a lower level apartment fire and hazards above, whether it be a door that got left open to the stair, and then you've got a high exhaust, and now you've got crews advancing down the flow path, or whether it be fire that exhausts out the back of the building and starts to extend up multiple floors into the attic space. We want to take a look at that problem decoupled and see what conclusions we can get from that. Here's our furnishings. Top left, you see the kitchen. The kitchens were installed as is. Again, for these buildings, the occupants moved out about 90 days before we got there. So these buildings were in fantastic shape. We didn't have to do much with them. We didn't even notice any effects from the Georgia heat, really. And the rest of the furnishings we provided. So we got the living room furnishings, the bedroom furnishings. And again, as the previous question was asked, we furnished them enough to be able to sustain flashover in these compartments for as long as we needed during the experiment. The bottom picture there on the right-hand side is the enclosed stair. That's pictured from the vantage point of the breezeway door. So if I open that exterior door to the stair and stand there, this is what I see. I've got a staircase up. I can go to the back of the building, get to the first floor, or down to the lower level. Experiment 1A, no ventilation. Here's our base case. We're going to light a fire in the back bedroom. You see the damage there in the bottom right-hand picture. Everything in terms of ventilation openings in the building is going to be closed. All the windows in the fire apartment door, and the breezeway door. Here's our case of how big can the fire get based on the oxygen that it has without us doing anything about it. The only thing that showed during the exterior, the only thing that showed to the exterior during this experiment at all was what you see pictured on the bottom left. That corner of the building that you see there lines up with the corner of the building you see pictured with the damage in the bedroom. So obviously that's our fire room that's on the opposite side of that wall. As that fire grew and pressure built inside the compartment, smoke started to exhaust from cracks around the foundation and the walls. And then as that fire transitioned to ventilation limited, temperatures dropped, pressure dropped, we stopped seeing anything showing from the exterior. So that fire that you see there in the bottom right, you'd pull up to at a given point in the incident and not see anything showing from the exterior. You'd get down to the apartment door, pop the door, and obviously find floor-to-ceiling smoke conditions. In this case, because we let the timeline go out long enough, once that front door to the apartment was popped, we didn't see any increase in fire behavior because the fire was basically out at that point. So the crew advanced in, they just had a compressed water can with them, took care of any hot spots, and we moved forward. Experiment 1B, now we go to an open apartment door. The open apartment door simulates an occupant leaving, and now the path between the apartment and the egress is open, and we've got a dirty stair. So we left the breezeway door closed, again, simulating that that might be on a self-closer, so the occupants got out, that breezeway door closed, but the stairwell's open. So we've still got a fire in the lower level bedroom, but now it's got the ability to exhaust into the stair, which allows it also to have more air to grow. So the goal here is to see how much more fire that scenario can sustain based on the more oxygen it has. And obviously, bottom right picture there, you can see that we had more fire damage at the end. This actually required the crew using the hose line once they got down to the lower level, and again, employed a flow and move. We know the benefits from that, from the front apartment door back into the bedroom, and took care of business. Experiment 1C, the video there is going to play here as I go. That's the ventilation crew getting ready to take the fire room window right at the time the engine crew is getting ready to make entry. So here's one of our coordinated cases where we want to see what happens if you make a vent on the opposite side of the suppression crew right before they start to flow water. So do we see benefits of having that vent ahead? So you see that the truck crew there is starting to take the window. By the time that he gets the window finished being taken and vented, you see that the suppression crew is already inside the compartment and the fire's knocked, highlighting the fact that that was a very closely coordinated sequence of actions, and again, sequence here being that ventilation preceded suppression. Everything started closed, so we obviously had the fire grow to its max potential in that bedroom, and then we started our interventions. Experiment 1D, very similar to 1C, but we added in a couple variables here. So we've got the same bedroom fire, everything's closed up at the beginning. We're getting ready to start our intervention. The truck crew gets ready to take that bedroom window at the same time the engine crew's getting ready to make entry. But this time, we're now looking at how are we going to best protect that stair. So not just is a vent ahead of us of benefit, but what does protecting the stair look like? So we know that door control in single families is primarily to limit fire growth to help us get to where the fire is, whereas door control in multifamilies is going to be much more about protecting that stair. So in this case, the engine crew got in, popped the door to the apartment, made their advance, and as soon as they cleared that threshold, a firefighter stayed at the apartment door and controlled that on their advance to try and limit all those products of combustion coming into the stair. And then at the end, once that fire was knocked down, as soon as they called out over the radio, fire's knocked, they're going to turn that to a narrow fog and start venting that out the window and see what we get there as far as improvement in conditions. 1E was our PPA attempt number 1. So again, much like the fire ground, things aren't always going to go as planned. Again, these are real buildings, real fires. So we're trying to simulate a PPA experiment here where we've got a fire in the bedroom. Again, that truck crew is going to vent that window just prior to the start of suppression, and then we're going to turn a fan in right as that suppression crew starts to make their advance. In this case, the truck crew vented the window. We didn't see any fire light up. We're watching the data. We're saying, all right, temperatures are dropping. Something's going on here. As soon as we start to get a little bit of visibility in that compartment, we see that that bedroom door closed. So at some point during that fire growth, the pressure inside that compartment as it expanded and contracted pulled that bedroom door closed inside and basically suffocated the fire before we ever got to do anything with it. It was a fairly interesting experiment that we were able to get some information from at the end because it would simulate the scenario of a truck crew getting to a fire compartment before the engine, and they're going to try and close that door to the fire compartment before the engine starts applying water. We go to experiment 2A. This time we don't want to run into any issues with pressure changes in the door closing, so we take the door off and we take the window out of play. So now when we start our intervention, we've got fire showing from the window on arrival. Again, the bedroom window being open from ignition. Everything else in the structure is closed. So we ignite fire in the bedroom, we let that fire go post flashover, and then we start our intervention. In this case, we're looking again at door control to protect the stair. So the suppression crew is going to make entry. As soon as they clear that threshold, the control firefighter is going to close the door as best they can. And then once fire's knocked down, we're now studying PPV, so that's the fan after knockdown. Versus 2B, which is PPA. So watch as this video plays on the right. The suppression crew is waiting for the countdown from command. All right, open the breezeway door. We've got our brief pause. The crew's going to get ready for entry. You see the firefighter turn to the right there and see the smoke and fire venting from the window. As the suppression crew makes entry here, you're going to see them get in position on the first floor so that they're ready to flow water as soon as that door opens. So they're not getting the door open and then getting ready. They're ready to say, all right, you good? Perfect. Pop the door. You're going to initially see a release of pressure from that apartment because it's been under higher pressure, but right before the firefighter goes inside, you see all those gases go back and inside the compartment. We've now pressurized the stair with that fan. We're protecting the egress path, and they're advancing back towards the fire compartment. Obviously, this is a tactic that is requiring close coordination between different other actions on the fire ground because of the fact that you're having forced or induced air into the structure at the same time you're applying water. So it could be of concern if you're not able to properly map in a quick enough fashion. Experiment 3A, this was a standard interior fire attack. So we got our breezeway door open, the crew's getting ready for entry. You see a heavy volume of fire showing from the exterior. The goal with these series of experiments was to increase the fire size and the hazard as we went further into the experiments. So they get back, they get in position, they know that they're opening into the living room, which was just venting fire on the outside, so they're going to be met with fire here at the door. As soon as that door gets open, they're met with fire, they get that bail open, and they start flowing and working their way in. So again, a case where they're going to be dirtying up the stair a little bit more, but can we use the flow and move to our advantage to keep stuff back inside the apartment? Experiment 3B is exterior fire control. So this one, we're going to let the fire get going a little bit more on the outside first. The window that you see there on the first floor venting fire is the kitchen. It's got a nice little corner there that's made up of the side of the building and the utility chase to be able to increase fire behavior and further rapidly spread that fire up the building. The fire is going to spread past the second floor, hit the eave line, right across the eaves, get up into the attic. It actually vented the second floor window and started burning contents on the second floor. The fire is also working its way around to the living room. You see the balcony there. You've got heavy, thick, dark smoke showing from that. We're not doing anything about that yet at this point, so we should expect that to light up here momentarily. Once we get basically this half of the building showing fire from the outside of the building, we're going to start our action. It's a little bit longer video, but I'm going to let it play out here. Again, keep in mind, if you show up at this point, be thinking based on your response model, what you're going to pull, where you're going to deploy the line, and what your actions are going to look like. So we've got now fire exhausting out of multiple openings on the first floor, auto extending up to the second floor, into the second floor, across the eave line, and into the attic. So fairly heavy volume of fire showing on arrival. 1 3/4 inch line. This was a smoothbore nozzle, 165 at 50 with a 7/8 tip. And we'll see what kind of damage they can do here. We remember proper water mapping wins inside or outside. One thing you'll note, as soon as the nozzle operator opens that line, he's going to keep it open until he's up and has the nozzle through the threshold of that compartment. So much like flowing and moving on the interior is a win, flowing and moving on the exterior can be a win. If we're concerned about our exposure hazards, start with your application high. Take care of what's going on in the eave line in the attic. We know from the attic study that the eave attack is extremely effective. Drop that stream down, get some water in the second floor, continue to bring it down to where the fire originated, and then get the line in the window. You saw that he got the nozzle in the window. We tried to do some better follow-up distribution in wet surfaces. Same thing applies to moving to the other side of the utility chase now. Took care of the exposure concerns and extension first. Now we get the nozzle into the compartment that's burning. Right at the end, you're going to see the stream come back and hit off the top of the living room slider. That gave us our lentil hit to get water into the center and again take care of business. What you'll notice now is as the crew transitions to the inside and they pop this door, they're obviously not met with any fire anymore. The smoke is more of a gray as they've started to take care of extinguishment from the outside, and we have much less of a hazard to the protected egress path inside. 4A for interior suppression. So this was a kitchen fire on the second floor. We wanted to get the fire to wrap around to the living room and show itself from the living room slider. What actually happened was the kitchen ceiling failed, and as you could see here from this picture, we've got kind of thick, nasty structural smoke showing from around the building. We basically had the kitchen fire start burning up into the attic, so we changed up our plan a little bit, went straight again for the interior attack, up the stairs into the apartment. Couple truck crews with them, start getting the place opened up and take care of the fire. Experiment 4B, this is our exterior fire control, so we're trying to get the same fire here. Fire that originated in the kitchen, showed itself in the living room. and we apply exterior water first. This was one of those good cases where we hear about, all right, well, what if I can't apply exterior water because there's stuff in the way or there's balconies that are going to impede the stream. Here was a good case where there were balconies impeding the stream, so we were able to get the smooth bore lined up in between the banisters and then use the lintel or the window header to our advantage to help with suppression. Interior spread, this is experiment 5 where we're taking a look at the hazards of an unprotected staircase. So you see the nasty smoke conditions that the nozzle crew faced as soon as they tried to make entry into that from the Alpha side. Here's what the Charlie side showed in the bottom right there with fire exhausting out of that terrace level apartment. And we had a variety of different things we were looking at here. So we had a fire that originated in the terrace level apartment. We left the stairwell door open, so the fire was allowed to exhaust out of that apartment and fill the stair. And then on the second floor, we had 2 apartments that were left open. So this is occupants that left their doors open. Either the closers didn't work or they caught on the carpet, and smoke started to fill those apartments. When smoke filled those apartments at the top, again, keep in mind we're 2 floors above the fire. One of those doors we closed relatively early on to show the impact of isolation. And then the other one we left open and went so far as to then go ahead and open the slider. So whether that slider is a truck crew that gets there and is trying to VES the second floor because they've got a report of somebody trapped and they don't want to go in the chimney, what happens if you make a vertical ventilation opening 2 floors above the fire, or what happens if that slider fails. Those were two kind of scenarios there. So when we talk about opening the slider 2 floors above that lower level terrace fire, here you see that slider getting opened. Again, it's all cabled and hooked up so we can do this remote from the ground. We pull that slider open. This apartment is 2 floors above where that fire originated from. You see the nasty, dark, turbulent smoke that's coming out of that slider and at the speed at which it's coming out. So at the instant that that slider got open, the fire that was showing out of the terrace level apartment in the back immediately went back into the apartment. That slider on the terrace level became 100% inlet. So now we've got the perfect scenario here, perfect storm. Inlet on the terrace level feeds the fire, churns it up the chimney and out the slider here. So inside this apartment, the temperature skyrocketed, gas concentrations decreased, and we saw pyrolysis on all the furniture here. It just didn't have enough oxygen to actually start flaming combustion. Experiment 6, exterior spread. So this is looking at the fire that's going to extend out the back, and we're going to let it run up all 3 floors via the balconies, run across the eave line, and start to get into the attic. Again, we left that sliding door open. We took the stairwell out of play here. We're just concerned about the stack of apartments with exterior spread. The interesting things about this experiment, we left the sliding door to the apartment above closed. The sliding door to the apartment 2 apartments above we left open. So just to see how fire and smoke would travel up the back of the building and how and if it would start to work its way into the building. This is the apartment that's directly above the apartment that's on fire. This is a view from the living room looking outside the sliding glass door. This sliding door is closed. Remember, it's the one that's above that's open. The flashing you see there is the fire raging on the balcony just outside that door. What you start to pick up on is the fact that the curtains on the window pyrolyzed and ignited before the sliding glass door failed. So there was enough radiant energy that transferred from the fire on the outside through the glass, ignited the combustibles before the glass even broke. And then shortly after the curtain caught fire, the glass itself failed, and then we had fire coming inside the unit. Here's a look at it from the Charlie side. This is from the crew operating in the rear. You see fire exhausting out of that terrace level apartment. On the left there, you see heavy smoke coming from the kitchen window. And again, we're just letting it go. You know, these are real fires, real buildings, real fuels. Let this thing walk itself up the back of the building, 2 floors, hit the eave line, get into the attic, and then let's see what we can do. The suppression method chosen for this was an initial line to the rear. What can we do? What damage can we do with 1 3/4 inches? Again, 160 GPM, 50 PSI. We had a backup 2.5 there in case things went awry. We had a master stream there. We also had 4 engines and 2 or 3 trucks on the Alpha side ready to go in floor by floor should things go awry. So the crew on the Charlie side there has got their line ready. They're waiting for the countdown from us as command to say, all right, we're good with fire conditions. Let's go ahead and start to suppress this, and then we'll see what happens. Again, 1 3/4 inch line, flowing an average amount of water. and what kind of damage can happen given the dramatic visual of the fire showing from the building. This case, again, it was not dictated to the nozzle operator how to apply the water, just apply water as you see fit. So in this case, he started with water into the fire apartment first, took care of the flashed over compartments in the fire apartment, and then brought the stream up versus starting high and bringing the stream down. Different logic, but justifications for both. And you can see here over the course of less than 30 seconds that I've been talking, we've got this fire pretty much taken care of. Obviously, we're going to need to get lines on the interior to those floors, confirm that we've got things completely extinguished, and do any mop-up that we need. But we've covered the fire in the attic, we've covered the fire that's extended 2 floors above and into those apartments, and obviously the fire originating in the apartment itself, with a 1 3/4 inch line, properly placed, properly mapping its advance. So tactical considerations for multifamily. We're going to cover some of the same ones that we talked about for single families. Do they hold in the higher life hazard? Then we've got several new ones for this study. What are our best means to protect the egress, being that center enclosed stairwell? What's our timeline of coordination in this type of structure? What are some size up and construction considerations? And then simultaneous streams, which we touched on briefly. So for survivable spaces, this is looking at a table from the report, and it's looking at FED values. So FED is fractional effective dose, and what it tells for us is whether or not a space would be survivable, or whether or not somebody would become incapacitated at a given percentage at a given time. So what you see there on the right-hand side is that our values have a wide range. They go from 0 all the way up to 17. So what that tells us, again, confirms that there is no clear-cut answer as to what space is survivable or not, based on what amount of fire you have showing from the outside and what type of structure it is. Again, with this, we need to assume survivable spaces exist, and even more so with this structure type because of the higher life hazard and the potential for occupants to be trapped above where a given fire might be. Water usage for this set of experiments. Interesting stuff noted here. Obviously, this was a smaller square footage, less distance to be applying water, so some of the experiments used less water than actually what you saw in a single-family home. Our one outlier there being experiment 5. Again, 2 colors here to touch on real quick. The darker blue is exterior water, so that's any stream that was applied from the outside in, versus the lighter blue, which was water applied from the inside. So experiment 5 being our outlier there, that's where we had to apply water from the inside and the outside at the same time for the crew to be able to finish their advance and get into the fire apartment. But at the end of the day, every other experiment in this series, and you've seen a lot of videos so far about how much fire was showing from the outside, we're not even using 265 gallons of water throughout the duration. And again, real fuels, real buildings. Just something to keep in mind. If we're properly mapping and we're using the right amount of water in the right place at the right time, it doesn't take much. Gas contraction is something that stuck out to me from the fire attack study that I feel is pretty important to get across. It's something that I like to harp on from the fire attack study, in that if we are effectively surface cooling, the gas contraction is always going to outweigh the steam expansion. So the concerns about getting steamed or being on the opposite side of a hose line and feeling the negative effects, typically that's because of a change in flow path or suppression that was not conducted effectively. If you're conducting effective suppression, you're going to see exactly what you see in these 2 pictures. This is from 1D, which we remember the truck crew takes the window, the room lights up immediately, and the nozzle crew is right there ready to flow water. As soon as they start to flow water, you see in that right-hand picture, you're not having massive steam expansion outside that room. The gases are actually drawing back into that room. Basically, think about everything coming to the center in that compartment as they contract and the pressures drop. So as you are cooling from 1500 degrees down to 200 degrees, everything is shrinking. You're pulling hot gases from other spaces in the building, drawing them into that fire room and cooling them. A good comparison there to think about is if you take a gallon acetone or paint can that's empty, doesn't have any residue in it, fill it about halfway with water and heat it up on a camping stove. You're going to start to convert some of that to water vapor and steam, and then we're going to go ahead and cap it. So now we've got a closed vessel. If we take that off the burner and we go and stick that in a bucket of cold water, what's going to happen? That can is going to completely shrink down and shrink in on itself. That's the same type of thing you see here, but magnified at a much larger scale. So when you talk about that small little experiment, you're taking something from 212 degrees and cooling it to maybe 40 degrees versus in a structure fire, 1,500 post-flashover degrees down to say 200 to 300. Contraction is that much more powerful. Impact of fire gases. So this is touching on the benefits of a flow and move approach on the inside of a building. What we're looking at here on the left-hand side is velocities. So that means how fast the gas is moving and in what direction the gas is moving. We're looking at it at the apartment door. So that's the door from the stairwell to the fire apartment. On the right-hand side, we're looking at gas concentrations inside the fire apartment. Again, much like before, the blue shaded regions are indicating the time at which water is flowing. So we see that as soon as water starts to flow, all of the gases at that doorway are going negative, meaning they're going inside. So because of that flow and move approach, we're pulling fresh air in behind us. It can exhaust out the window ahead of us. We're improving conditions behind us as we advance and don't let any products come back past us. That's improving survivability as we advance into the building. At the same time, as soon as water starts to flow, you see those gas concentrations improve. Immediately, the oxygen's on its way back to 21. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide are on their way back down. We're making things better by flowing water and keeping that nozzle open. Cool as you go. Here's an example from 3 different spots in the apartment: bedroom, living room, and kitchen. You see that the temperatures, as soon as that line gets open, drop like a rock, and what you see is they stay there the entire time. What you would notice is if we shut that line down to be able to advance, so for example, we opened the front door, we flowed water from a fixed position, and then shut down to get further in, immediately that fire that's still churning in the bedroom is going to be pumping out stuff back over us. So we want to take control of that space, keep the line open, and cool as we go. Alternative hits. This is a little snapshot from the video that we saw before of the exterior application. There was a little bit of fire lingering left in the center of the compartment, so before the line gets shut, just bring it back to the window header, deflect it off of that, get the water to drop down and take care of business. Impact of isolation. So here are a couple experiments where we take a look at isolated versus non-isolated. Experiment 1E that says isolated fire room there. That was our PPA attempt number 1. So that's where we tried to get the fire to do what we wanted to, but the door to the bedroom closed. When it did that, it actually showed us what it would look like if the truck was able to get to the bedroom or the fire room and close that door before the line was ready. We see that we've obviously got more survivable conditions in the common space than we would in the case where we weren't able to isolate that room. Apartment H and apartment F there, this was from experiment 5, which was our interior spread. So that's where we had all that nasty smoke and fire coming up the center stairwell. These are the top 2 floor apartments. Both of those had the door open from the very beginning. But apartment H that you see on the bottom left there, we closed the door fairly early. So any smoke that was in there was just lingering and lazy, never fully descended, and we didn't get any hazardous conditions in that apartment. Whereas you now see what I was talking about in the exposure apartment with the door left open, where the furniture is now all pyrolyzed and was about to start burning. So protect the egress path. Here are some means that we can best protect the egress path, knowing that these tactics may work for you guys and may not work for you guys depending on the response model. The first of which there in the top left is talking about positive pressure attack. That could be compared to much like a high-rise building where you're going to go and you're going to create an attack stair or a egress stair where you're going to pressurize that stair and try to keep it protected. Same sort of thing applies here. The fan got placed at the breezeway door. At the same time the engine goes in, the fan gets turned on. They're trying to pressurize that and keep all the nasty stuff in the fire apartment. That's one way to be able to protect the egress. The next would be door control that you see in the top right. So the suppression crew gets to the apartment, opens the door, starts their advance. One firefighter hangs at the door to be able to help manage that kink point, but at the same time be able to keep the door closed and limit stuff exhausting into the stair. We know that because they're doing a flow and move, that's also going to further help keep stuff coming from behind. Bottom left there, we see interior attack. Obviously, it's going to be the dirtiest of them all, but keep in mind we have these other means to be able to help protect the egress path. If the egress path is not as of a concern, meaning you've searched and exited those spaces prior to commencing the attack, or the breezeway is open, by all means have at it. When you see on the bottom right there, initial exterior fire control, when we've taken care of darkening down some of that fire from the outside first, we see there's much less of a hazard in the egress path for the stair. And then other means of protection, flow and move suppression. We talked about how you're taking control of your space. And then lastly, hydraulic ventilation. This series of experiments for me really showed the benefits of hydraulic ventilation, magnified much more so than I've seen previously. So the one case where we had a bedroom fire, we knocked down the bedroom and then turned the nozzle to a narrow fog and started flowing out the window. Keep in mind, we're 3 rooms deep inside that apartment. Because of the fact that we had the apartment door open and limited ventilation elsewhere, when the nozzle firefighters started employing hydraulic ventilation, they were able to pull smoke from the 2nd floor stairwell landing down the 1st floor in the apartment, through the apartment and out the window. So hydraulic ventilation in itself, just by the crew that went in and knocked down the fire, not any sort of truck crew or any other firefighter involvement, just the crew that was doing the fire suppression, hydraulically ventilated, they were able to clear out the egress path just as quickly as you would with a fan or any other means. So then we start putting the pieces together of how can you combine this to have the most effective attack. Are we going to pressurize the stair? Are we going to rely on door control? Are we going to rely on getting some water in from the outside first if we've got a good presentation of fire? You know, how can we put this into our response model and see where it fits? Timeline of coordination. This is broken out into 3 pieces. So there's uncoordinated ventilation and suppression, coordinated ventilation and suppression, and then coordinated suppression and post-suppression ventilation, meaning we're going to coordinate ventilation after suppression. What this here just shows is that whenever we're not coordinating our ventilation, things are going to deteriorate. On the left-hand side, 1B and 5, those were 2 experiments where the apartment door got left open. Obviously, fire is going to continue to grow and spread out into the stair. On the right-hand side, we performed ventilation to try and get the fire to do what we wanted it to do. So it wasn't considered a fire department intervention, but we're able to get some information from that at the end. So in experiments 3A and 4A, we ventilated the kitchen windows to try and help that fire move around that space and get those compartments to flash over. It also gave us some good times to see the time window then between when we make a vent and when we'd start seeing things go bad. In experiment 3A, anywhere between 1 minute and 2 minutes was our time window between making a ventilation opening and that compartment transitioning to flashover. Experiment 4A, it was just about over 1 minute. When we talk about coordinated, I'm going to go quickly through this. These are 4 experiments where we closely time suppression and ventilation, whether it be just prior to suppression or just after, and things were successful across the board. We see there on the bottom, door control was effective at limiting the inflow of fresh air, not just exhausting the products of combustion, so that was stopping the fire growth itself inside the compartment. And then 2A and 2B, that was our PPA versus PPV. Post-suppression ventilation. So we learned from the single families that we want to ventilate remote spaces as quickly as possible once water's on the fire. Same thing goes here. For experiment 1A, which is what you see on the top there in the schematic and the text on the left there, where we didn't do any sort of ventilation after suppression, the CO didn't drop below ideal H thresholds until 618 seconds after fire was knocked down. So that smoke was just sitting stagnant, keeping those spaces not survivable, even though the fire was knocked down well beyond past any sort of suppression. As soon as we do hydraulic ventilation, we're considering this a pull source, meaning that the nozzle firefighter operating the hose stream is at the ventilation opening, pulling the smoke out, versus the fan where it's pushing fresh air in. In this case, we saw that the CO dropped below ideal H thresholds in just over 2 minutes. In the case where we did PPV, which was our push source, and we pressurized the space with fresh air, it was a little bit over 2 minutes, closer to 3 minutes, but again, drastically different compared to not doing anything at all. So for size up and construction considerations, when we pull up to a building and see fire that we see here in this picture coming from multiple openings on a given floor, extending up to apartments above or the eave line and attic space above, what are things we need to think about? What is the type of construction? What is the siding made of? Are we concerned about combustible balconies? What is my exposure concerns? Again, is it the attic or is it occupied space above? Do we have much of a fire presentation showing at all? If we just know that the fire's on the first floor and maybe it's just starting to lick out the windows, or the truck crew's going to take the window for me, maybe I just head straight inside, get ready to do my interior attack, protect the stair that way, and push in. Or if I'm concerned about exposure concerns like this, maybe I need to start with exterior water, darken it down, get the eave line, drop the stream in, and then move inside. At the end of the day, the big question comes around whether or not your stairwell is enclosed. And if your stairwell is enclosed, is your stairwell dirty? So as you get there, pop into that stairwell and say, is this clean or not? That might help dictate your actions. If that stairwell is clean, it could be much like a high-rise building where you might want to clear exposure apartments before you open up the main fire apartment door. It could be the same case here. Whereas if that apartment door was left open and you've got a dirty stair, maybe I need to head there first to be able to protect that egress path. So for flow path awareness, experiment 1B on the left, that's where our fire apartment door was left open, but we had no other exterior openings. So we didn't see too much of a deterioration in conditions in the stair. Also because the front door was so far back from where the entryway to that lower level apartment was. Whereas experiment 5 on the right-hand side, we know we had a lower level inlet and we had a high level exhaust. So now we again have that perfect storm where as soon as we make an opening and try to advance, we're going to experience rapidly deteriorating conditions on the inside. So simultaneous streams. The 3D cutout on the right-hand side there, the two nozzles that you see were the positions of the crews on the inside and the outside when they were flowing water. The side Charlie views there were what you were able to see from the exterior and how the crew applied water. We didn't have any vantage point of the crew on the inside. You would just see a black screen and a lot of people trying to get a lot of water flowing. So this was experiment 5. Again, the crew is trying to enter into that chimney and push downstairs. They were able to get in and flow water in a manner that they could occupy the space, but not properly map their advance. So if we look at that schematic of the building, we see that the interior crew would have to go back the first floor, down the stairs, make a 180, go back towards side alpha, and then turn into the apartment. Well, from the first floor, no matter how much they try, they're not going to get water to map where they need to get what's burning. So they were able to flow water to be able to occupy the space, but they could not make the advance down the stairs. So they held their position in the stairwell, kept flowing water to be able to occupy the space, and called for an exterior line. And then we had the crews from the Charlie side flow into the apartment as best they could. We remember the takeaways from the fire attack study. What's our best means for exterior water? Perpendicular to the opening, steep as can possibly be, minimal air, don't occlude the opening. Well, you see the first application of water there in the top left. It's not really effective at all in terms of what we would consider ideal, but it was drastically had a positive impact on the inside of the building, meaning that even though the angle was shallow, even though it was not perpendicular to the opening, even though they were far enough back that the stream was starting to break up and entrain some more air, the fact that they got water in that compartment was the win, and they were able to start dropping temperatures. They repositioned, you see there in the bottom left picture, closer to more perpendicular, got the angle a little bit more steep, and were able to further knock that fire down to the point where the crew on the inside that was in the exhaust portion of the flow path this whole time. So keep in mind all our concerns about opposing hose streams and being on the opposite end or being in the exhaust portion of the flow path. If we're properly mapping and properly applying water, this crew that was on the inside in the exhaust didn't feel any negative effects whatsoever. They actually felt relief and said, okay, thank you, now we can get down the stairs. So once that exterior line is flowing, they're able to get down the stairs on the inside, make the turn, get into the apartment, and take care of business. Chief, any questions so far for multifamily? All right, perfect. We'll bring it home with strip malls. So for strip malls, this was an exploratory look into commercial style structures. So up to this point, again, we're primarily looking at the residential fire environment, whether it be single-family homes or multifamily dwellings, which is basically the residential environment just in a different structure type. Here, we're starting to get into a different animal. So we're not going to answer all of our coordinated questions with these experiments. We're not going to really come away with too much takeaways other than what is this fire doing inside this structure type. We know that the water is going to map differently because we've got drop ceilings. The fires are going to behave differently, but how does it compare to the residential environment? So for these, we headed out to Fairborn, Ohio. We seemed to really find a lot of buildings in Ohio for this series of experiments, but it worked out perfect. Fantastic host departments. This was Fairborn, just outside the city of Dayton. And we instrumented this strip mall. We conducted 7 experiments. The experiments here were primarily looking at ventilation, not so much suppression or coordination, but really to try and open our eyes and say, how do fires burn in this structure type? We focused on horizontal ventilation and then a combination of horizontal and vertical, and did some experiments highlighting the need for coordination. This was our structure here. You see it in the top right there from the alpha side. It was an L-shaped building with multiple occupancies of different size. The shortest occupancy in depth was about 70 to 75 feet in depth. The shortest in width was about 30 feet wide, and the biggest of which we used was about 70 or 75 feet wide by 70 feet deep or so. Charlie side of the building, you see there in the center left, CMU block walls with steel man doors to the rear. It was unprotected bar joists, which we'll talk about here in a little bit as far as the roof structure goes. The picture on the right in the center was a little bit more of a close-up of the alpha side of a given unit. We see full plate glass windows across the front with a little aluminum transom on the bottom. And then on the bottom right there, that was our fuel load for these experiments. So we left the drop ceiling in play. Any places where the drop ceiling was missing, we added tiles back in, so it was a complete uniform ceiling. And then we provided the fuel. You'll notice that the fuel here is much different than we used in multifamily or single-family dwellings. So the fuels here, what we used, are called commodity boxes. So this is basically a cardboard box that's filled with hard plastic, which is polystyrene cups, and they are layered with cardboard inside of them. So it's not cups stacked within one another. It's a row of cups, a layer of cardboard, a row of cups, a layer of cardboard. And these are very well characterized in the lab. So it gives us that heat release rate value of how much fuel we're putting in this space. It's a very repeatable fuel, and it's a fast-growing fuel. So this was a fairly good representation of what type of fuel you might have in a given commercial occupancy, whether it be rack storage, in office-type space, or so on and so forth. The one thing you don't see here that we want to expand on in future research would be adding in some sort of actual rack shelving to be able to provide some more obstructions for the hose stream. Again, this wasn't a suppression study. We're just trying to see how things burn. 7 experiments. Again, we briefly touched on the fact that we're looking at both horizontal ventilation and vertical ventilation. You can see when the front windows were all taken there in the bottom left, what fire conditions look like. We actually installed vertical vents ourselves in one of the units there you see in the bottom right. We did 4 4x4 holes to give ourselves 64 square feet of vertical ventilation that we were able to open remotely from the exterior on the ground. So we could call for 1 vent, 2 vents, 3 vents, or 4 vents, be able to close them if we wanted to, and get an idea of what was going on inside the structure. So we always do our base case. In experiment 1, we light the fire inside the compartment, leave the doors closed, leave the windows closed, no ventilation, let the fire go and see what happens. In this case, we saw an initial rise in temperatures, the space filled with smoke, the temperatures increased, the pressures increased until there was no more oxygen available for combustion. At that point, we know we're going vent limited. The temperatures are going to drop, the pressures are going to drop, things are going to shrink back down. You see there in the bottom what the fuel load looked like at the beginning compared to what the fuel load looked like at the end. Because we didn't give it much more oxygen, we see that there was a whole lot of fuel left at the end. So we know that we had enough fuel to sustain the experiment, but we didn't have enough oxygen to be able to burn it all up. Now we do experiments 2 and 3. We're starting to look at varying options of horizontal ventilation. So we get there, all right, what happens if we sequentially take vents? So let's take one of those window panels, then we'll take 2, then we'll take 3, versus going up and taking them all at the same time. Much like the residential environment, depending on the structure size and the volume, you're going to see an increase in temperatures. We see on the bottom left chart, when we take one window, we get a slight step up in temperatures. Again, we're allowing more oxygen in to allow more fire, to allow more to exhaust. Then we take 2 more windows, and you see the floor temperatures actually come up, meaning we flashed over the space. On the right there, we see that initial increase in temperatures. We tried to catch it at its peak before it went vent limited, take the glass all at once, transitions the space to flashover, but because we provided so much ventilation, the space actually stratified again, meaning there was cool air in low, hotter gases coming out at the top. Here's pictures of what that looked like on the bottom. The horizontal openings on the left there, we see we transitioned the space to flashover. It again went back to a cooler temperatures low, higher temperatures high. And then on the right-hand side there, 50 seconds after the ventilation openings were made, the space has obviously gone to flashover. So now we get to experiment 4, which is taking a look at double the volume of space, but the same amount of horizontal ventilation. So what if we have much more volume on the inside, but the same amount of windows up front? So we see there at ignition, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute. At ignition all the way up to 2 to 2.5 minutes, we don't see much of a change. We see the fire just starting to get going in the boxes. At 3 minutes, we start to see a drastic change as that exponential growth takes off and the fire starts really growing inside the space. By 4 minutes, the smoke layers dropped all the way down and we've completely blacked everything out. When we look at the temperature chart in the top right, we see that the temperature started to rise and we experienced an initial brief flash inside the entire volume, and then it went back to being stratified, slowly increasing temperatures until we started to do different means of suppression. Horizontal and vertical, this was our one coordinated experiment for the series. So we actually popped a topside vent at the same time that suppression started, was very effective. The topside vent allowed the gases to exhaust as we were suppressing them. You see that time stamped in the picture in the bottom left. There are other concerns with vertical ventilation on these type structures, obviously being unprotected bar joists. We'll talk about collapse here in a little bit. But this was effective, at least in terms of fire behavior. Great job at getting the hot gases out as we were suppressing from the front door. Knowing there, as you can see from the picture, that we limited horizontal ventilation to keep those temperatures lower. Experiment 6, now we start messing around with vertical ventilation sizes. You can see there on the right-hand side, 30 seconds after the first vent. The first vent was 4 by 8 in size. The tech panel guidance to us said that that was roughly the size you'd start with in a commercial space if you were going to employ this tactic. And then we went ahead and enlarged that to double the size, 64 square feet. What does that look like? What does that look like for us at the front of the building? The front door was drawing fresh air in at about 15 miles an hour. And each one of those exhaust vents, because of how this efficient became, fresh air in, hot exhaust out, was about 30 miles an hour of exhaust out those vertical vents up top. So obviously the floor temperatures rose and we flashed over the space. Now we get to experiment 7, worst case scenario, maximum vertical ventilation, maximum horizontal ventilation. We see that we flashed over the compartment entirely. We've got fire out the front and fire out the roof vents. Temperatures stay high throughout. Again, things that we know from the residential environment, more air, more fire, but we want to confirm that this is going to hold true in commercial. So just 3 tactical considerations for the strip malls. Again, it was an exploratory look. But if we talk about timeline of coordination, there's something to be said for withholding ventilation in these type structures until our water's in place and flowing. Because even though we're applying water, these structures are of such large volume that if we start to make horizontal vents, we might not be appropriately mapping enough to counter the horizontal vents as they're being made. So again, as we limited those vents, we still had much of the fuel remaining, and we were able to keep that fire at a relatively low size. Obviously, adding additional oxygen via taking windows, we're going to start to see an increase in temperatures. And then coordination, whether it be through suppressing with horizontal ventilation or suppressing with vertical ventilation, or just suppressing period and ventilating thereafter, knowing that our occupant survivability is not as much of a concern in these type structures is something to consider. So initial size up and fire growth. This is the second consideration from this study. And this series of pictures is looking at experiment 4. This is where I talked about twice the volume for the same amount of ventilation up front. What we started to notice was this phenomenon of this pressure buildup and this pressure wave. We saw it in a very, very early on experiment, but we didn't think too much about it. We just thought it was a fluke where the fire grew in size. It built up enough pressure to pop the front door open, and then we had to force it closed again, where in this case, we left the front door open. And what we were noticing was that the fire is able to outpace the amount of ventilation it has. So keep in mind that in a normal residential building, our ceilings are 8 foot, and our doors are going to go up to 6 or 7 foot. So there's not too much of a space between the top of the door and the top of the compartment. Whereas in a structure like this, our door height is the same, but I might have 8 feet of space between that and where the actual ceiling deck is. So I can support a lot of fire growth before it's able to actually exhaust out. And the fire is going to grow so quick that it outpaces the amount of ventilation it has, and it's going to need to take a big burp and exhaust all of this pressure out. So in this case, the smoke that exhausted out of this structure went out 75, 100 feet. It lasted for almost a minute, 45 seconds or so. I'll show a video of it here coming up, but this is a fairly common phenomena that you see. You see all these videos come out on YouTube. If you guys have seen the Alpha Bowling Lanes video from, I think it's up in New York, you see this just pressure wave coming out of this building. You know, the recent fire that they had in LA City, it was likely some sort of pressure-driven phenomena like this, more so than compared to an explosion. So for commercial type occupancies, this is something we need to be thinking about. And when we talk about size up, maybe it's not positioning a rig right in front of the building or right in front of the door. Maybe it's thinking about, all right, do we need to wait for this wave to pass, or can we catch it beforehand? One thing we did notice was that if we took all the vents, we were able to alleviate that pressure wave, assuming obviously that it was followed up at or right after with suppression. But we'll show a video here of what this looked like actually in real time. Much like you guys would in the fire service, we positioned our trailer and our data operations right in front of this building. We came to regret that soon afterwards because we couldn't close the window quick enough. Our trailer's positioned right there in the bottom of the screen. We're like, all right, what's going on? Why is the smoke coming towards us? Wait a second, this is what's going on. All right, this is filling up. I can't breathe. I don't know what's going on. We start exiting the trailer. You see all the crowds start to move around. Look at the smoke coming out of that door right there. It looks like there's a fan on the opposite side of that, blowing that directly at where we are. That's pure fire dynamics that's not driven by any wind, no fan, there's nothing induced. That's purely how commercial buildings and this type of structure with the ventilation openings are going to behave. And then we see that as soon as it took its big exhale out, it was like, all right, I'm good now. I'll start inhaling some more air and exhausting up high. We look at it from a closer vantage point here. You see that we've got a real nice collection point with this awning that's like 12 feet deep, really high, but this smoke is coming out at such a high velocity, it's completely bypassing that. And as it's taking its breath out, that smoke layer is dropping in the compartment. As the smoke layer drops, temperature rising, and then we start to experience a brief flashover while it's doing this exhaust. So if you look at this, I mean, this is coming out of this door at 30 miles an hour. There's no way that you're going to combat that with a stream. You're not going to combat it with a fan, nothing. You can alleviate it, again, by taking the windows or starting to apply water or waiting it out. It's so fast that it picks up material off the ground and throws it into the parking lot. You see that as that layer drops down, then we start to get our flaming combustion as we get that oxygen burning. The space transitions to flashover briefly. It says, all right, I'm good, and then it starts to go back to its normal behavior. But it's a phenomena that you may see on a commercial building and should give you pause or at least thought to where you're showing up in the incident and how your operations might play out. One last vantage point here, and then we'll move forward. So again, this is from the other side. You can see how horizontal it's coming out before that buoyancy is even allowed to take over and bring it high into the air. Dropping within that doorway as the layer goes. You can see the air currents that are picking up on the sidewalk here just from being in proximity. Again, wasn't any wind that day. Right as it gets to the bottom there, you start to see some little flickers of flame, but this is a long duration event that looks like something is going on, whether it's a fan, weather, somebody did something on the other side, but this is just purely fire behavior. And then last but not least, for commercial strip malls, the construction of these type of buildings is something that should give us pause and consideration for our operations. The schematic in the top right there shows the roof construction for this particular structure. We had CMU walls in both the Alpha and Charlie sides of the building. We had an I-beam network about halfway back, and then our unprotected steel bar joists ran from the A to the C side. Two sets, one that brought us from the front to the middle, and then the second that brought us from the middle to the back. Those, again, were unprotected from the bottom side, as you see there to the left. You had a drop ceiling throughout the entire space, so you couldn't see them, but we know that as that fire gets going, that aluminum channel holding up the drop ceiling is going to warp. Those tiles will fall down, and now you've got fire exposure to actual structural members. So you see the damage there on the left-hand side. We didn't let these experiments go for all that long, and not every single one of them even transitioned to flashover. But even those that didn't, we saw significant deterioration and deformation of these beams. So much so that because of the beam orientation running front to back, we saw that the CMU walls in the front and the back would actually push out. We'd start to see cracks in the building. We needed to establish collapse zones, keep the crews back. Again, another reason why this was not a suppression study, it was a figure out what these buildings do study. With that, one of the interesting experiments that fortunately happened very early on in the series, we actually had a complete failure of the roof system. What was interesting to us is that early on in the experiments, as these beams heated up and pushed out, we started to see some cracks in the walls, but they stopped. In this set of experiments, we actually had what are called string pots or string potentiometers up on the roof in a network that would be able to tell us whether that roof is moving up or down or in any fashion. As the fire grew within the space, we saw the roof actually lift up. So the fire created such a pressure that the roof actually lifted up, and then as that fire started to go vent limited and darken down, it then brought itself back down to normal. But after that fire event was over and after the experiment was over and we were getting ready to begin mop-up operations, the beams cooled enough that they pulled off of those walls that originally had been moved out when they heated, and then it dropped the whole roof in. So this was pretty eye-opening for us that 30 minutes into the incident, the fire's completely knocked, things are good, we're taking a breath, all right, the experiment's over, and then all of a sudden the roof drops as those beams cooled. So again, these type of structures can provide some high hazards to us, and we need to really be cognizant about what we're doing and whether or not we're concerned about actually getting inside of these, for any potentially trapped occupants. Limiting ventilation, minimizing crews operating on the inside of the building, so on and so forth, knowing that the structure itself is a large hazard to us. With that, that's about all I've got. I know it's a tremendous information dump, so I appreciate those of you that are still there and still watching at the end of this. We've covered some takeaways from single families, from garden-style apartments, and then a brief look into strip malls. Our website, ulfirefightersafety.org, has all of this information on there. You can download the reports and get as deep as you want to. You can go to the videos that we have and watch all of these experiments play out and see all this phenomenon happen. Again, ulfirefightersafety.org. These are all of our social channels: Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Gmail. And then last but not least, this is my contact information. That is my email address and my cell phone number on there. It may take me a little bit to get back to you, but I will respond to you. So any of you that have questions, whether it be about the research that we just talked about, or you have experience that contradicts what we're showing, or you have questions about it, or maybe an idea for future research, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I welcome any feedback, and thank you all for your time. Any questions, Chief? Perfect.
Thank you much, Keith. Great stuff there. As we close things up today, just a couple of closing remarks. This entire presentation will be available on the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue YouTube channel a little bit later today, and it'll be archived there, so it'll be available for future viewing. Thank everybody for attending. A couple of quick thank yous. Again, Keith Stakes, thank you for the loan from UL to provide that valuable information for us. And again, thank you, Lieutenant Josh Burchick from Howard County Fire and Rescue, Engine 7, for very, very excellent presentations today. Also, I'd like to thank the committee members that worked on this project over the last several months. That'll include Battalion Chief Steve Hardesty, as well as Captain Josh Hummel, Captain Brandon Tebow, Captain Craig Matthews, Firefighter Debbie Jenkins, of course Keith and Josh involved in that process, retired Battalion Chief Gary Jones, as well as Celeste Flynn. And in closing, let's remember what Celeste said in her intro video. Let's give 6 minutes for Nate every day. 6 minutes for yourself, 6 minutes for your family, 6 minutes for your crews. Again, 6 minutes for Celeste, and most importantly, give that 6 minutes for Nate every day. Thank you all.